Ladies and gentlemen, here's Gareth Morris. He is going to be talking to us about homeless and personal growth. Gareth Morris, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm glad to say that the only piece of technology I brought myself this evening is a piece of paper, my cheat sheet. I also fear that following Charlie, I'm about to change the tone of the evening somewhat because it's on the theme of homelessness, which is probably doesn't have as much comedy value. But what homelessness does do is it does tell us something about personal growth and how we develop as people throughout our lives. But before I get into talking about a bit more about the research I've been doing, I just want to remind you that there are different kinds of homelessness that are affecting people. The first group of these are rough sleepers, and these are the people that we tend to see in the public eye and people we see on the streets, but there are also guys who are sofa surfing. There are people that are sleeping in homeless hostels. So there are these different kinds of homelessness to be aware of. But more recently, it's the rough sleepers that have had more attention, and this has been because, well, like a lot of things, it's the immigrants that have taken the flak for this. In London, it's believed that there's more rough sleepers now than there was before, and what happened is that if you can cast your minds back to the days of single-party governments, that party at that time did decide that they wanted to eradicate rough sleeping in the UK in total. The cynical among us had some ideas about this because they set a target for this, which is 2012. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's a rather large event happening in London in that year. And the last thing we want when we have all these visitors to our shores is to have those people think that that we're anything less than a socially just and inclusive society. My research has been focused on the city of Stoke-on-Trent, and it also happens to be a city that I was born and grew up in, so I feel like I've got quite a nice personal connection to a lot of people that I'm talking to, finding out about. And so far I've been talking to a lot of single homeless people who are living in hostels, as well as some women with families. So generally speaking, what I've been doing is just sort of hanging around these hostels and talking to people and getting to know them, getting my feet under the table and kind of learning the sort of culture of hostel life. And what's happened is when people agree to take part in my research, what happens is I take them off to a little room that I sort of refer to now as my interrogation suite. Because it's a kind of tiny little room, and if you've ever seen that film, The Lives of Others, you might be able to relate to this. It's like a desk and two chairs, there's a filing cabinet and a tiny little window. And so we sit there and I ask them all about their lives, because the research I'm doing is about life story research. So I'm digging around in people's pasts, their biographies and their histories, and finding out all about them. And they do talk quite freely about the past, and they're quite happy to do this. One of the most important things I've learned from it is it's just so important to take a non-judgmental attitude towards people. And this is because as a researcher, I need people to open up and to talk about the intimate and personal things in our lives. So it's not my job to reassure people, to guide them or advise them to agree or disagree, or to tell them that there's anything sort of positive or negative about the things that they've done with their lives. But this actually has a very powerful therapeutic value to it, and they do get into the flow of it. Within a few minutes they sort of, like I say, they sort of talk quite openly about it. I also had a fear when I began to do this that I would kind of be doing these interviews and start digging around in people's pasts and a lot of bad memories, and that I might leave them quite upset by doing it. But what I actually found was that there was actually the opposite is true. because when you just sort of sit and let somebody talk to you for an hour, you can sort of get a lot out of that. And when I sort of finished these interviews, quite a few people said to me that they told me things about themselves they never talked about before, that they managed to get a lot of things off the chest. And they start to get some sort of insight into the behaviours and the past and the relationships with the families and things like this, and start to think about how they might be able to alter some of those things. So this is quite a nice sort of bonus, really, I think to what I'm doing. But some of the most interesting people that I like to listen to are the guys that have been in the army. I don't know if you know much about people who have come out of the army and become homeless. And I never understood it until quite recently. And like a lot of people, what tends to happen is they've had fairly crappy upbringings and quite bad relationships with the parents and the families and all sorts of things. And by the time they're 16, they're really keen to get away from those parents and to become independent, and so they join up at the army. And then it starts to talk about the army life in a really positive way. It's the best time of their life, and it's given them a lot of meaning. It's been really challenging for them, and there's been a lot of camaraderie. They made a lot of friends, and like I say, it's talk really enthusiastically about this time of their lives. But what tends to happen is they might leave the army for various reasons. It might be a health issue, it might be a disciplinary issue. So they sort of come out of the army, and because they've been earning some good money and they haven't been spending any money while they've been in the army, so you say, I've come out and I've got 10, 15 grand in the bank. But as you might expect, as they've left home at 16, they've never actually developed the independent living skills that I guess most of the rest of us do in that time. So these guys come out, and what the young guys tend to do when they've got time and money on their hands, and they don't actually appreciate the value and the power of money, and they kind of just keep going to the ATM. They think it's going to last forever. Of course it doesn't, but they do blow it, having a bloody good time. And that's quite good for a while. But of course they get to the end of that, and then they become homeless. And some guys, they might have had some sort of tragic events if they've been to Iraq and things like this. So they need to, they look to find comfort in other things, and that has its own sort of set of problems and consequences. So what I also find very interesting about what people talk about is actually what they don't talk about, because I think we sort of come at it as academics and as policymakers, and we problematise homelessness in a certain way. But what you actually find is when these guys are talking about it, I don't think they actually identify themselves as being homeless. Certainly not in the way that we do, because how many of us identify ourselves as a person who lives in a home? I guess it's not the first thing that we would think of. So they don't talk about that. But they do talk about a lot of things, and they talk about the childhood, and they talk about their adolescence and their adult years, and they'll tell me about the families, and they'll tell me about abuse and neglect, and about rejection and drugs and gangs and crime, mental health problems and all these sorts of things. So they do share an awful lot. But one of the things they do talk about is they talk about the mistakes they've made. There goes 2 minutes. I'll do this, no problem. They talk about the mistakes they've made in their lives, and they talk about the future, and they talk about their ambitions, and they talk about the people that they want to become, and that's it. They talk about how they want to grow as people, and that's it. That's the end.
Gareth Morris, ladies and gentlemen.